Lady Francesca Lovelace stood in the ballroom of Ashford House, near the refreshment table, her gloved hands clasped before her coral silk gown, watching the swirl of dancers with practiced composure. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that painters begged to capture: dark chestnut hair arranged in elaborate ringlets, eyes the color of warm honey, and a figure that made modistes weep with joy at how perfectly gowns draped her frame. Tonight should have been her triumph. In 3 weeks, she would marry Henry Talbot, eldest son and heir to the Marquis of Whitehaven. The announcement had sent ripples of envy through every drawing-room in Mayfair. Henry was handsome, charming, wealthy beyond measure, and, most importantly, he had chosen her. Or so everyone believed. Francesca took a small sip of champagne, her eyes following Henry across the ballroom. He was dancing with Miss Arabella Thornton for the 3rd time tonight. His hand rested perhaps a touch too low on her waist. His smile was perhaps a touch too intimate. Miss Thornton's cheeks were flushed with more than exertion. "Your fiancé seems quite energetic this evening," Lady Catherine Pemberton murmured beside her, snapping her fan open with a decisive click. Catherine had been Francesca's closest friend since their presentation at court 5 years ago, and she had never liked Henry Talbot. "Indeed," Francesca replied neutrally, taking another sip. "Francesca, you cannot possibly—" "I can, and I shall," Francesca interrupted gently. "Please, Catherine, not here." But Catherine's concern was written plainly across her face. For the past 3 months, whispers had circulated. Henry Talbot, seen leaving the opera with Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, a married woman notorious for her affairs. Henry Talbot, purchasing an elaborate ruby necklace, which Francesca had never received. Henry Talbot, spotted at a gaming hell until dawn, deep in his cups and deeper in debt. Francesca had heard every whisper. She had observed every sidelong glance, every pitying smile from other ladies who thought themselves so subtle. She had watched her fiancé with clear eyes and a calculating mind. She had been a fool, not for missing the signs. Those she had seen clearly enough 3 months ago. No, her foolishness lay in the choice she had made 3 years prior. The music swelled to its conclusion, and Henry finally escorted Miss Thornton back to her mother before making his way toward Francesca. He was undeniably handsome: golden hair, blue eyes, the kind of classical features that belonged on Greek statues. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. "My darling Francesca," he said, bowing over her hand. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You look ravishing tonight." "Thank you, Henry. You seem to be enjoying the dancing." "The Thornton girl is light on her feet," he said dismissively. "Nothing compared to you, of course." "Of course," she echoed. Something flickered across his face, irritation perhaps at her tone. Then his expression smoothed into practiced charm. "I wonder, my dear, if we might take a turn on the terrace. There's something I wish to discuss with you." Francesca's heart began to beat faster, but her face remained serene. "Certainly." They walked through the French doors onto the terrace, where the cool April night offered relief from the stifling heat of the ballroom. Other couples strolled nearby, maintaining proper decorum. Henry led her to a more secluded corner, near the stone balustrade overlooking the garden. "Francesca," he began, and she heard the rehearsed quality in his voice. He had practiced this. "I find myself in a rather delicate position." "Do you?" She turned to face him fully, her expression politely curious. "Indeed, you see, I have come to realize that perhaps our understanding was made in haste. We are not, I think, as well suited as I initially believed." "I see." Her calm seemed to unnerve him. He had expected tears, perhaps, pleading. "You are a woman of great beauty and accomplishment," he continued, warming to his theme now. "But I have come to understand that my heart has been engaged elsewhere. It would be unfair to you, cruel even, to continue with this engagement when my affections lie in another direction." "How very considerate of you to think of my feelings," Francesca said softly. "I knew you would understand." Relief flooded his features. "You are ever so reasonable, my dear. I have always admired that about you. And this other lady, the one who has engaged your heart so completely, would she happen to be Miss Arabella Thornton? Or perhaps Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth? Or possibly Lady Charlotte Weston?" The colour drained from Henry's face, then returned in a furious rush. "How dare you? How dare I?" Francesca's voice remained low, but steel entered her tone. "How dare you, Henry Talbot, conduct yourself like a rutting stag while wearing my betrothal ring? How dare you court half the ladies in London while promising yourself to me? You have no proof of such scandalous accusations." "Don't I?" She tilted her head. "I may not have caught you in flagrante delicto, but I am not blind, nor am I stupid. I have watched you for months. I have seen exactly who and what you are." Henry's handsome face twisted into something ugly. "If you knew, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you end it?" "Because I was waiting," Francesca said simply, "for you to reveal yourself completely. And now you have. You insufferable woman," he hissed. "Did you think to trap me? To expose me and force me to marry you regardless? On the contrary." Francesca drew herself up to her full height. "I was waiting for you to save me the trouble of breaking the engagement myself. A gentleman ending an engagement causes a scandal for the lady. A lady ending an engagement causes a scandal for the gentleman. But a gentleman ending an engagement publicly, before witnesses, because he wishes to pursue other women." She smiled coldly. "That, Henry, makes you look like exactly the cad you are." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by panic. They were not alone on this terrace. Several couples had drawn closer, attracted by their raised voices. Lady Ashford herself stood near the French doors, her face alight with interest. "However," Francesca continued, her voice now pitched to Carrie, "if you wish to end our engagement, I certainly will not stand in your way. After all, it would be cruel of me to bind you to a commitment your heart has clearly wandered from." "Francesca, wait. I believe we have said all that needs to be said." She pulled off his betrothal ring, an elaborate affair with a large sapphire, and placed it in his palm. "I wish you every happiness, Mr. Talbot." She turned on her heel and walked back toward the ballroom. Behind her she heard Henry sputter, heard the gasps and whispers beginning to rise like a tide. By tomorrow morning, all of London would know that Henry Talbot had publicly ended his engagement to Lady Francesca Lovelace. The gossips would feast on it for weeks, and Francesca had exactly what she wanted. Catherine appeared at her elbow as she re-entered the ballroom. "Heavens above, Francesca, what happened?" "I am no longer engaged," Francesca said calmly. "I believe I shall go home now." "But you cannot simply leave. The scandal will be Henry's to bear, not mine." Francesca squeezed her friend's hand. "Trust me, Catherine. I know what I'm doing." She collected her cloak from the footman and walked out the front entrance of Ashford House. The night air was crisp and clean after the overheated ballroom. Her carriage would take several minutes to be brought around from the mews. She stood on the front steps, breathing deeply, feeling lighter than she had in 3 long years. She had been such a fool. 3 years ago, another man had courted her. Quietly, seriously, with none of Henry's flowery poetry or grand gestures. Richard Wickliffe, Duke of Westwick, had called upon her father, had taken her driving in Hyde Park, had engaged her in conversations that made her think, rather than simply flutter her eyelashes. But Richard was difficult to understand. He rarely smiled. He spoke in measured tones about serious subjects: estate management, agricultural reform, the Irish potato crisis. He never brought her flowers or compared her eyes to stars. He seemed to study her with those intense grey eyes of his, as if she were a fascinating puzzle he was determined to solve. It had unsettled her, made her feel exposed. Henry, by contrast, had made her feel safe. He had told her she was beautiful every time he saw her. He had brought roses and recited poetry. He had been everything a romantic young girl thought she wanted. What a naive little fool she had been. When Richard had asked in his direct way whether she returned his regard, she had hesitated. That hesitation had been answer enough. He had bowed, thanked her for her honesty, and wished her every happiness. 2 weeks later, Henry Talbot had begun his pursuit in earnest, and she, still smarting from the strange hurt of Richard's withdrawal, had let herself be swept up in Henry's theatrical courtship. Then, 6 months into her engagement to Henry, she had encountered Richard at a charity gala. She had expected coldness or indifference. Instead, he had asked her to dance. "You seem troubled, Lady Francesca," he had said as they moved through a waltz. "I am perfectly content, Your Grace." "Are you?" Those grey eyes had studied her face. "Because if you ever find that you are not, if you ever find yourself in need of assistance, I want you to know that I will be there." She had laughed, uncomfortable. That is very gallant, Your Grace, but I cannot imagine what assistance I might require. Can you not? He had turned her through a spin, his hand firm at her waist. Henry Talbot is not the man you think he is, Francesca. The use of her given name had shocked her. I beg your pardon? I am not speaking from jealousy, though you would be forgiven for thinking so. I am speaking from knowledge. Henry Talbot has debts that would stagger you. He has appetites that a wife will never satisfy. He needs your dowry, Francesca, that is all. Anger had flared hot in her chest. You overstep yourself, Your Grace. Perhaps. He had met her eyes steadily. But when you discover the truth, and you will discover it, because you are far too intelligent not to, I want you to remember what I am about to say, which is, whatever decision you make, I will be there to support you. If you choose to stay with him, I will respect that choice and trouble you no further. But if you choose to walk away, his grip had tightened fractionally. If you choose to walk away, Francesca, I will be there to catch you. All you need do is tell me when you need me. The waltz had ended. He had bowed and left her standing in the middle of the ballroom, her heart pounding. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of watching Richard from across crowded rooms. 3 years of catching his eyes on her and seeing what? Patience? Determination? 3 years of slowly, painfully realizing that he had been right about Henry. And 3 months ago, when the first whispers had reached her ears about Henry's infidelities, she had understood what Richard had been offering. Not a rescue, not a solution, a choice. He had given her the truth, and then stepped back to let her decide what to do with it. The sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones drew her attention. But it was not her family's carriage approaching. It was a magnificent black equipage drawn by 4 matched horses, with a ducal crest emblazoned on the door in silver and midnight blue. The carriage stopped directly in front of her. The door opened. Richard Wycliffe, Duke of Westwick, sat inside. He wore evening clothes, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, as if he had been running his hands through it. His grey eyes met hers with an expression she had never seen before. Hope, uncertainty, and something that made her breath catch. "Lady Francesca," he said quietly, "it appears you find yourself in need of a carriage." "It appears I do, Your Grace. Your own will arrive shortly, I'm certain, but mine is here now." He paused. "The choice, as always, is yours." Francesca looked back at Ashford House. Through the windows, she could see the crowd gathering, pointing toward the terrace where Henry was no doubt attempting damage control. Tomorrow, the scandal sheets would eviscerate her. She would be pitied, scorned, whispered about, unless she gave them something more interesting to talk about. She looked back at Richard, at the man who had warned her, who had waited, who had promised to be there when she needed him, who had, she realized with sudden clarity, been courting her all along, not with flowers and poetry, but with honesty and patience and the steady certainty of his regard. Francesca smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn all evening. "Well then, Your Grace, it would be rude of me to keep your horses standing in the cold." She walked down the steps and placed her hand in his. The touch sent electricity through her entire body. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and he helped her into the carriage. She arranged her skirts as he settled beside her, proper distance between them, everything perfectly respectable. Except nothing about this was respectable at all. "Richard," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "Yes, Francesca? Thank you for waiting." His smile transformed his entire face, chasing away the austere lines and revealing something softer underneath. "I would have waited forever." The carriage pulled away from Ashford House, just as the crowd spilled out onto the front steps. Francesca didn't look back. She kept her eyes on Richard, seeing him clearly for the first time in 3 years. "I have been such a fool," she whispered. "No." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. "You were young. You wanted poetry and romance. There is no shame in that. But you offered me something real, and I rejected it for pretty words and empty promises. Then we shall simply have to begin again." His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "Though I should warn you, Francesca, I am not a patient man by nature. These 3 years have been the longest of my life." "Then why did you wait?" "Because you were worth waiting for." He said it simply, as if it were obvious. "Because forcing you or manipulating you would have meant nothing. I needed you to choose me, Francesca. Of your own free will, with clear eyes and a full heart. And if I had chosen Henry? Pain flashed across his features. Then I would have mourned what might have been and done my best to respect your decision. But I confess, I did not make it easy for him. Every social event I attended, I made certain you saw me. Every dance card I signed, I hoped you were watching. Every conversation we had... He broke off, laughing softly. Heaven above, I was shameless. You were persistent, she corrected. And you were right about Henry. I take no pleasure in being right about that particular subject. Don't you? She tilted her head. Not even a little. Well, a slow smile curved his lips. Perhaps a very little. He never deserved you. And you do? No, Richard said honestly. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to. The carriage turned onto Grosvenor Square. Your Grace, the coachman called down. Where shall I take the lady? Richard looked at Francesca. Your choice, he said quietly. I can take you to your parents' house, or... He hesitated. I have a proposition for you, Francesca. Rather an scandalous one, I'm afraid. I'm listening. My estate in Kent, Westwick Abbey. I could take you there tonight. Your reputation would be in tatters, of course. You would have to marry me to salvage it. His eyes searched hers. But you would also have time away from London, away from all of this, to decide if that is truly what you want. To decide if I am truly what you want. That is rather scandalous, Francesca agreed. Her heart was beating fast, excitement and fear warring in her chest. It is entirely your decision. If you wish to go home, I will understand completely. We can proceed slowly. Let me court you properly. How far is Kent? Francesca interrupted. Richard blinked. I beg your pardon? How far to Westwick Abbey? I find myself quite curious about your estate. The hour is still early. She met his eyes. Drive on, Your Grace. Joy, pure, unfettered joy, transformed Richard's face. He leaned out the window. Westwick Abbey, John, best speed. Aye, Your Grace. The carriage lurched into motion, heading toward the London Bridge and the Kent Road beyond. Richard sat back, still holding Francesca's hand, looking at her as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. You are absolutely certain? He asked. Once we leave London at this hour, there will be no going back. The scandal will be tremendous. Good, Francesca said firmly. Let them talk. Let them gossip. 3 years ago, I chose the safe path, the respectable path, and it led me nowhere but misery. Tonight, Richard Wycliffe, I am choosing the dangerous path. I am choosing scandal. I am choosing you. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her gloved knuckles. Then I shall do everything in my power to ensure you never have cause to choose otherwise. Through the carriage window, London passed by in a blur of gaslight and shadow. Somewhere behind them, the gossips were already beginning their work. By morning, all of England would know that Lady Francesca Lovelace had left her broken engagement and disappeared into the night with the Duke of Westwick. But Francesca found she didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, she felt free. Richard? Yes, my dear. Tell me about your estate. Tell me about Westwick Abbey. And so, as the carriage carried them through the night, toward a future neither could have predicted but both had chosen, Richard began to speak. Not in flowery poetry or empty flattery, but in the honest, serious tones that Francesca had once found unsettling and now found utterly captivating. She had spent 3 years chasing the wrong dream. But that night, in a ducal carriage racing toward Kent, she finally began to chase the right one. The journey to Kent took nearly 5 hours, even at best speed. Dawn was painting the sky in shades of rose and gold when the carriage finally turned through the gates of Westwick Abbey. Francesca, who had dozed fitfully against Richard's shoulder for the last hour, a liberty he had graciously offered and she had gratefully accepted, stirred as the carriage slowed. She sat up, suddenly conscious of how improper their position must have appeared. But Richard merely smiled and adjusted her bonnet, which had gone slightly askew. "Welcome to Westwick," he said softly. Francesca looked out the window and gasped. The abbey rose before them like something from a Gothic novel, ancient stone walls covered in ivy, tall windows gleaming in the early morning light, towers and turrets that spoke of centuries of history. But it was not forbidding. Gardens surrounded the main building in carefully manicured splendor, and the warm golden stones seemed to glow with welcome. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's home," Richard said simply. "Or at least, I hope it will become yours as well." The carriage stopped before the main entrance. Richard first, then handed Francesca down with careful courtesy. Despite the early hour, the front door opened immediately, and a distinguished-looking butler appeared, his expression betraying not a flicker of surprise at his master, arriving with an unaccompanied young lady at dawn. "Your Grace," the butler said, bowing. "Welcome home. Shall I prepare the rose room for your guest?" "Yes, thank you, Stevens. And please, ask Mrs. Davies to attend Lady Francesca. I imagine she would appreciate an opportunity to refresh herself and perhaps rest after our journey." "At once, Your Grace." Francesca stepped into the entrance hall and found herself surrounded by history. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Wycliffes staring down with varying degrees of severity. A grand staircase curved upward to the floors above. Fresh flowers filled every alcove, their scent mixing with the smell of beeswax and old wood. "This has been your family's home for how long?" she asked, turning slowly to take it all in. "Since 1542, Richard said, coming to stand beside her. "My ancestor, Thomas Wycliffe, was granted the estate by Henry VIII after the dissolution of the monasteries, hence Abbey." He pointed to a particularly stern-looking portrait. "That's Thomas. Apparently he had a gift for being in the right place at the right time, politically speaking. He looks formidable. Family legend says he was also quite charming when he wished to be, though you'd never know it from the portrait." Richard offered her his arm. "Come, let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted." A plump, motherly woman in a housekeeper's dress and keys bustled into the hall. "Your Grace, we had no word you were coming. Oh, my stars, and with a guest. You should have sent word ahead." "My apologies, Mrs. Davies. It was a rather spontaneous decision." Richard's tone was warm with affection. "This is Lady Francesca Lovelace. She will be staying with us for a time. Please ensure she has everything she needs." Mrs. Davies looked between Richard and Francesca, and understanding bloomed in her round face. "Of course, Your Grace, of course. Oh, how wonderful. Come along, my lady. The rose room has the loveliest view of the gardens. We'll have you comfortable in no time." "Thank you," Francesca said, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over her shoulders. Richard caught her hand before she could follow Mrs. Davies upstairs. "Rest," he said quietly. "We'll talk later, when you've had time to think clearly. And Francesca," he hesitated, "you are under no obligation here. None whatsoever. This is your home for as long as you wish it to be, whether that is a few days or—" He trailed off meaningfully. "Or forever," she supplied, raising an eyebrow. "I live in hope." Despite her exhaustion, Francesca found herself smiling. "I appreciate your patience, Your Grace." "Richard," he corrected gently. "If we are to be scandalous, we may as well be familiar." "Richard, then." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you. For everything." She followed Mrs. Davies up the grand staircase, acutely aware of Richard's eyes on her, until she disappeared around the corner. The rose room was aptly named, decorated in soft pinks and creams, with enormous windows overlooking formal gardens that were beginning to bloom with spring flowers. A fire had already been lit in the hearth, and the bed looked impossibly inviting. "Let me help you out of that gown, my lady," Mrs. Davies said, already moving to unfasten the buttons. "You'll want to sleep properly. I'll have hot water sent up for a bath when you wake, and we'll press your dress. Though if I may say so, my lady, you'll need more clothes if you're to stay longer than a day or two. I suspect I will need to send to London for my things," Francesca said, letting the housekeeper help her out of her ball gown and into a borrowed nightdress that had been laid out on the bed, "though I cannot imagine my mother will be eager to send them." "Mothers often come around," Mrs. Davies said wisely, turning down the bed. "His Grace is a good man, my lady. The best I've known in 40 years of service to this family. If he's brought you here, you may be certain his intentions are honourable." "I believe they are," Francesca said softly, climbing into the bed. The sheets were crisp and smelled of lavender. "Mrs. Davies, has he ever brought anyone else here, any other lady?" The housekeeper's face softened. "Never, my lady. Not once. There was talk in the servants' hall, you see, 3 years ago. We all thought, well, but then you chose another gentleman, and his Grace, he—" She shook her head. "He closed himself away for months. Wouldn't see anyone. Wouldn't attend any events. We worried terribly. But then one day he came out of his study, and he said to me, he said, 'Mrs. Davies, I intend to be patient. She will come to see the truth eventually.' And when she does, I will be waiting." Tears pricked at Francesca's eyes. "He said that?" "He did indeed. And patient he has been, my lady. 3 long years. But I could see it wore on him, watching and waiting and hoping." Mrs. Davies patted her hand. "You're here now, though. That's what matters. You rest, dear. Things always look clearer after sleep." Francesca sank into the pillows, meaning to stay awake, to think through everything that had happened. But exhaustion claimed her within moments, and she fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she'd had in months. She woke to afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birdsong in the gardens. For a moment, she was disoriented. This was not her room in her parents' London house. Then memory flooded back, and with it came a moment of pure panic. What had she done? She had left London with Richard Wycliffe, unmarried, unaccompanied, unchaperoned. By now all of London would know. Her reputation was in absolute tatters. Her mother would be hysterical. Her father would be furious. And Henry could go to the devil. That thought made her smile. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Davies with a tea tray and news that a bath had been prepared in the adjoining dressing room. "His Grace requests the pleasure of your company for dinner this evening, if you are feeling well enough, my lady. 6 o'clock in the small dining room." "Please tell His Grace I would be delighted," Francesca said, accepting a cup of tea gratefully. The bath was heavenly, scented with rose oil and hot enough to ease the stiffness from hours in a carriage. Afterward, wearing her freshly pressed ball gown, she had nothing else, Francesca studied herself in the mirror. She looked different. Her eyes were brighter. The tension that had settled around her mouth over the past year had eased. She looked, she realized, happy. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like relief. Stevens appeared at precisely 6 o'clock to escort her downstairs. The small dining room was actually quite large by normal standards, but she supposed it was small compared to the formal state dining room. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the table was set for 2 with gleaming silver and delicate china. Richard stood as she entered, and Francesca's breath caught. He had changed into fresh evening clothes, his dark hair still slightly damp from bathing, and the way he looked at her, as if she were the answer to a question he'd been asking for years, made her heart skip. "You look rested," he said, coming forward to hold her chair. "I trust Mrs. Davies took good care of you." "She was wonderful. Richard, your home is magnificent." "I'm glad you think so." He took his own seat across from her. "I've always thought it would be even more magnificent with someone to share it with, but until recently, I was rather particular about who that someone might be." "Were you?" Francesca accepted a glass of wine from Stevens, who then withdrew discreetly, leaving them alone. "Decidedly particular," Richard confirmed. "There was one specific lady who occupied all my thoughts. Rather inconveniently, she was engaged to someone else for quite some time." How inconvenient, indeed. Quite maddening, actually. He took a sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tell me, Francesca, when did you know? About Henry, I mean." She considered the question seriously. "In truth, I think I knew from the beginning that something wasn't quite right. But I didn't want to know, if that makes sense. It was easier to believe his pretty words and ignore the discrepancies." "And what changed?" "You did." She set down her glass. 3 years ago, when you warned me, I was angry. I thought you were jealous, trying to sabotage my engagement, but your words stayed with me, and gradually I began to watch more carefully, to notice the things I had been ignoring. "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't. You told me the truth. That's a gift, Richard, even when it's painful to hear." She paused as Stevens returned with the first course, a delicate soup garnished with fresh herbs. "When did you know? About your feelings for me, I mean." "The moment I first saw you." He smiled at her startled expression. "You were 18 at your presentation at court. You caught your heel in your gown as you curtsied to the Queen, and you laughed, this bright, genuine laugh that you tried to smother behind your hand. Everyone else would have been mortified, but you found it amusing. I thought to myself, that is a woman who doesn't take herself too seriously. That is a woman worth knowing." "I'd completely forgotten about that," Francesca laughed. "I was terrified I'd made a terrible impression." "You made an unforgettable impression, at least on me." His expression grew serious. "I am not an impulsive man, Francesca. I don't make decisions lightly. But from that moment I knew. I spent the next year engineering introductions, arranging to be at the same events, finding excuses to speak with you, and when I finally worked up the courage to court you properly, you were—" he gestured helplessly. "You were radiant, intelligent, kind, everything I had hoped and more. And then I chose Henry." "And then you chose Henry," he agreed, "which was your absolute right to do. But I confess, Francesca, it nearly destroyed me." The raw honesty in his voice made her throat tight. "I was such a fool." "No," he said firmly. "You were young. You wanted romance and passion. Henry offered you that, or seemed to. I offered you estate management discussions and political debates. You offered me substance," Francesca corrected. "You treated me like I had a mind worth engaging. Henry treated me like a beautiful ornament to be displayed and admired. And yet you chose the ornament. For a time." She met his eyes. "But I'm here now, Richard. I'm here because 3 years ago you told me the truth. And last night you offered me a choice. No coercion, no manipulation. Just a choice. And—" his voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "And I choose you," she said simply. "I choose honesty over poetry. I choose substance over style. I choose a man who waited 3 years rather than one who couldn't wait 3 months to betray me." Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were suspiciously bright. "You have no idea how long I've waited to hear you say that." 3 years, I believe." 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, he corrected. "But who's counting?" Despite the emotional weight of the conversation, Francesca laughed. "You actually kept track? I am nothing if not thorough." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Francesca, I want to be absolutely clear about something. Yes, arriving here with me has created a scandal. Yes, society will expect us to marry to salvage your reputation. But I don't want you to marry me out of obligation. I don't want you to marry me because you have no other choice." "Then why should I marry you?" "Because you want to," he said simply. "Because we suit each other. Because when I imagine my future, you are in every single moment of it. And I cannot envision happiness without you." He paused. "But I am also aware that 3 days ago you were engaged to another man. Your emotions may be in turmoil. You may be acting on impulse or anger or hurt. So I want to give you time." "How much time?" "As much as you need. We'll tell society we're engaged, of course. That will satisfy propriety. But the actual wedding, that happens when you're absolutely certain, whether that's a month from now or a year from now or—" "Tomorrow," Francesca interrupted. Richard blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I said, what about tomorrow?" She smiled at his stunned expression. "Richard, I don't need time to think. I've had 3 years to think. 3 years to compare you to Henry, to realize what I gave up, to understand what I truly want. You asked when I knew. About Henry, about everything. I knew 3 months ago. The moment I saw him flirting with Mrs. Ashworth at the opera, something clicked into place. I saw him clearly for the first time, and do you know what my first thought was?" "What?" "My first thought was, Richard tried to warn me." She squeezed his hand. "You were right, Richard, about everything. And I was too proud and too stubborn to admit it. So I waited. I watched Henry dig his own grave, and I planned exactly how I would extricate myself from that engagement in a way that made him look like the villain he is." "That was quite calculated of you." "I learned from the best." She raised an eyebrow. "You didn't think I failed to notice your strategy, did you? Showing up at every event I attended, making sure I saw you, reminding me constantly that you were still there, still waiting. I had hoped I was more subtle than that." "You were about as subtle as a cavalry charge," Francesca grinned. "But it worked, because every time I saw you, I remembered that conversation we had. Whatever decision you make, I will be there. That's what you said, and you meant it." "I did. I do. So here I am." She stood, still holding his hand, and moved around the table to stand before him. "Making my decision, clearly and consciously, with no doubts whatsoever. Richard Wycliffe, Duke of Westwick, I choose you. Today, tomorrow, and every day after, if you'll have me." He rose to his feet, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "If I'll have you. Francesca, you are all I've wanted for 3 impossibly long years. But are you absolutely certain? We can wait." "We should wait." "I don't want to wait," she whispered. "I've wasted enough time already." "Then we won't wait," he breathed, and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste, proper kiss Henry had given her when they became engaged. A brief, passionless pressing of lips that had left her feeling vaguely disappointed. Richard kissed her like she was air and he was drowning, like she was fire and he was freezing, like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Francesca rested her forehead against his. "Well," she said shakily, "that was rather more satisfactory than estate management discussions." Richard laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. "I do contain the occasional surprise. I'm beginning to realize that." She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Richard, I mean it. I want to marry you, as soon as possible. Special license, small ceremony, whatever you think best. I don't need a grand society wedding, I just need you." "Special license it is then," he said decisively. "I'll ride to Canterbury tomorrow and procure one from the Archbishop. We can be married by week's end." "Perfect," she smiled up at him. "And then we'll return to London and face the gossips together." "You're certain you want to return? We could stay here, avoid society altogether for a time." "Absolutely not." Francesca's voice was firm. "I will not hide as if I've done something shameful. We will return to London, attend every event, and let them all see that I have made the best decision of my life. Let them whisper and speculate. Let Henry squirm. Let Miss Thornton and Mrs. Ashworth and all the others realize exactly what they've won. A handsome face attached to an empty, deceitful heart." "Remind me never to get on your bad side," Richard said, but he was smiling. "You're rather formidable when you're angry." "I'm not angry anymore," Francesca said truthfully. "I'm happy. For the first time in 3 years, Richard, I am genuinely, completely happy." "Good," he said softly. "Then my work here is nearly complete. I have only one task remaining." "Which is?" "To make certain you stay that way." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "Every single day, for the rest of our lives." "That sounds like an excellent plan." They returned to dinner, now quite cold, and talked for hours. Richard told her about his estates, his responsibilities in the House of Lords, his passion for agricultural reform, and his concerns about the working conditions in industrial cities. Francesca shared her own interests, literature, music, and her involvement in charitable work with orphanages in East London. "I should have asked you about all this 3 years ago," Richard said ruefully. "Instead, I droned on about crop rotation and drainage systems." "I would have listened," Francesca assured him. "But I wasn't ready to hear. I was looking for fairy tales, Richard. You were offering me real life. And now I know that real life is far more valuable than any fairy tale." She covered his hand with hers. "Fairy tales end with happily ever after. Real life is where you build that happiness, day by day, choice by choice, together." I could not have said it better myself. They talked until past midnight, until the candles burned low, and Stevens gently suggested that perhaps they might wish to retire. Richard escorted Francesca back to the Rose Room, and at the door he kissed her once more, tender and sweet and full of promise. "Sleep well, my dear," he murmured. "Tomorrow, everything changes." "Tomorrow," Francesca echoed, "everything begins." She watched him walk away down the corridor, then closed the door and leaned against it, smiling. Tomorrow Richard would ride to Canterbury. In a few days they would be married, and then they would return to London and face whatever came next. Together. The words sang through her like music. For 3 years she had felt alone, even engaged to Henry, perhaps especially then. But now, standing in this beautiful room in Richard's ancestral home, she felt the weight of solitude lift from her shoulders. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. Francesca climbed into bed and fell asleep still smiling, dreaming of grey eyes and honest words, and a future she had stopped believing in, but had somehow miraculously found. 3 days later, Lady Francesca Lovelace became the Duchess of Westwick, in the small Norman church that sat at the edge of the Westwick estate. The ceremony was simple, attended only by the household staff and a few trusted friends Richard had sent for, his cousin Lord Edward Hartley and Edward's wife Margaret, who were thrilled at the news and wholly unsurprised by it. "Took you long enough," Edward had said, clapping Richard on the shoulder. I was beginning to think you'd pine away into nothing. Your faith in my persistence is underwhelming, Richard had replied dryly. Margaret had embraced Francesca warmly. I am so glad you've come to your senses, Your Grace, truly. We have been watching Richard suffer for 3 years. Please call me Francesca, and I promise to make up for all 3 years. See that you do, Margaret had said with a wink. Now, standing before the rector with Richard's hand warm in hers, Francesca spoke her vows with absolute certainty. She promised to love, honor, and cherish. She promised to be faithful in prosperity and adversity. And when Richard slid his family's wedding ring onto her finger, an elegant band of gold engraved with the Wycliffe crest, she felt tears of joy slip down her cheeks. With this ring, I thee wed, Richard said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. The rector beamed at them both. I now pronounce you man and wife. Your Grace, you may kiss your bride. And Richard did, sweetly and thoroughly, while Edward cheered and Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Mrs. Davies sobbed happily in the back pew. When they broke apart, Richard whispered, Hello, Duchess. Hello, husband, Francesca whispered back. They returned to the Abbey for a wedding breakfast that Mrs. Davies had somehow managed to make magnificent, despite only 3 days' notice. The staff had decorated the dining room with spring flowers and ribbons, and someone had unearthed an ancient bottle of French champagne from the wine cellar. To the Duke and Duchess of Westwick, Edward toasted, may they enjoy many years of happiness, numerous children, and considerably less romantic angst than they've put us through these past 3 years. Hear, hear, Margaret added, raising her glass. After breakfast, as the others chatted in the drawing room, Richard drew Francesca aside. I have something for you, he said. A wedding gift. Richard, you've already given me everything. Humour me. He produced a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a delicate necklace, a pendant of sapphires and diamonds arranged in the shape of a flower. This was my mother's. She wore it on her wedding day, and her mother before her. I've been saving it for you specifically. Even 3 years ago I knew. Francesca touched the pendant with reverent fingers. It's exquisite. Let me? Richard fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle on her skin. There. Perfect. I don't have anything for you, Francesca said, turning to face him. I left London with nothing but the dress on my back. You gave me yourself, Richard said simply. That's quite sufficient. She kissed him for that, slow and deep, until Edward's voice called out from the drawing room, Oi! None of that until you've properly scandalized London first. They broke apart, laughing. Your cousin is impossible, Francesca said. My cousin is right, Richard replied. We should return to London, face the gossips, let them see that we are blissfully happy despite, or perhaps because of, all their whispers. When do we leave? Tomorrow, if you're willing. I've already sent word to the London house to prepare for our arrival, and I've sent a letter to your parents. Francesca stiffened. What did you say? That their daughter is now the Duchess of Westwick, and that we would be honored by their attendance at a formal reception to celebrate our marriage. He touched her cheek. They are your parents, Francesca. Whatever your differences, they deserve to know you're safe and happy. My mother will be furious, undoubtedly. But she'll also be the mother of a duchess. That will soothe considerable hurt feelings. You're remarkably optimistic. I've just married the woman I've loved for 3 years. I believe I'm entitled to some optimism. They spent their wedding night in Richard's chambers, far grander than the Rose Room, with a massive 4-poster bed and windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. Richard was gentle and patient, taking his time, making certain Francesca felt treasured and desired in equal measure. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of passion, Francesca traced patterns on Richard's chest. You're full of surprises, Your Grace. Am I? He sounded pleased. Decidedly. I was led to believe you were all cold logic and serious discussion. I contain multitudes, Richard said solemnly, then grinned when she laughed. In all seriousness, Francesca, are you happy? Truly? Deliriously, she assured him, though I suspect the real test comes tomorrow, when we face society. Let them come, Richard said, pulling her closer. We'll face them together. The return to London the following day was considerably more civilized than their midnight escape had been. They travelled in Richard's finest carriage, Francesca wearing a new travelling dress that Margaret had insisted on gifting her. "You cannot return to London in a wrinkled ball gown, my dear. What would people say?" As they crossed London Bridge and entered the familiar streets of Mayfair, Francesca felt her stomach tighten with nerves. "What if—" "No," Richard interrupted gently, taking her hand. "No what-ifs. We know exactly what awaits us. Gossip, scandal, social censure. But we also know that none of it matters. You are the Duchess of Westwick now. That carries considerable weight, regardless of how our marriage came about. Will we be received, do you think? By some, certainly. By others, perhaps not. But I suspect you'll be surprised by who supports us and who doesn't." He was right. The first caller to the Westwick London residence, a magnificent townhouse in Grosvenor Square, was Lady Catherine Pemberton, who arrived mere hours after they did. "Francesca!" Catherine swept into the drawing-room and embraced her friend fiercely. "Thank heavens you're safe. When you left Ashford House I was beside myself with worry. But then the gossip started and I knew you were with the Duke, and I thought, well, good for her." "You're not scandalized?" Francesca asked, surprised. "Scandalized? My dear, I'm delighted. Henry Talbot is a scoundrel and you've secured one of the best matches in England. Everyone worth knowing thinks you're terribly clever." "And everyone not worth knowing?" Richard asked dryly. "Oh, they think she's ruined and you're a rogue, but who cares what they think?" Catherine waved her hand dismissively. "The important thing is that you're happy. You are happy, aren't you?" "Ecstatically," Francesca assured her. The second visitor was less welcome. Francesca's mother, Lady Margaret Lovelace, arrived in a flurry of silk and barely suppressed fury. "Francesca Rose Lovelace," she began, then stopped, clearly remembering her daughter was no longer a Lovelace. "I mean, Your Grace." The title came out stiffly. "What were you thinking, running off in the middle of the night with a man regardless of his title? The scandal, the shame." "Mother, I am perfectly well. Thank you for asking," Francesca said calmly. "May I introduce my husband, the Duke of Westwick? Richard, my mother, Lady Margaret Lovelace." Richard bowed with perfect courtesy. "Lady Margaret, I apologize for the irregular nature of our courtship. However, I hope you can find it in your heart to be happy for your daughter." Lady Margaret sniffed, but some of the anger faded from her face. "Well, you are a duke. That's something at least. And Henry Talbot has proven himself to be exactly the sort of man one does not want for a son-in-law. The stories that have emerged—" She shuddered delicately. "What stories?" Francesca asked sharply. "Oh, my dear, debts, gambling, women, plural. Apparently he was betrothed to you primarily to access your dowry and pay off his more pressing obligations. The Marquess is beside himself. Henry has been sent to their estate in Northumberland in disgrace." Francesca and Richard exchanged glances. "How very unfortunate for him," Francesca said without an ounce of sympathy. "Yes, well," Lady Margaret softened slightly. "I suppose in that light your impetuousness was actually rather wise. You escaped a terrible fate, Francesca. And you have secured an excellent position." She looked at Richard appraisingly. "You will be good to her, Your Grace." "I will spend every day of my life ensuring her happiness," Richard said simply. "See that you do." Lady Margaret rose, preparing to leave. "I expect you both at dinner next week. Your father will want to meet his new son-in-law properly. And Francesca," she paused at the door, "I am glad you are safe. Truly." It was as close to an apology as Lady Margaret Lovelace was likely to come. Francesca accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Mother." Over the next week, London society gradually divided itself into camps. The younger set, led by Catherine and several other progressive-minded ladies, thought the entire affair was terribly romantic. The older, more conservative matrons were scandalized, but couldn't quite cut the Duchess of Westwick. Richard's title and influence were too significant. The gentlemen, for the most part, congratulated Richard on his decisive action and secretly envied him his beautiful, clever wife. And then there were those who simply found the whole situation amusing. "I heard," Lord Edward told them at a dinner party 2 weeks after their return, "that Henry Talbot has been refusing to leave his room. Apparently he's mortified by the whole business." "Good," Francesca said with satisfaction. "My dear Duchess," Edward said admiringly, "you are positively ruthless." "Only when circumstances require it," she replied sweetly. The true test came at the Bransfords' ball, the first major social event Richard and the married couple. As they entered the ballroom, conversation didn't precisely stop, but it certainly faltered. Every eye turned toward them. Richard, magnificent in his evening clothes, kept Francesca's hand tucked securely in his arm. "Smile," he murmured. "Let them see how happy you are." So Francesca smiled, radiantly, genuinely, and watched as the gossips' faces fell slightly. They had expected shame or embarrassment. Instead, they got joy. Lady Bransford herself, one of society's great hostesses, approached them immediately. "Your Graces, how delightful to see you. May I say, Duchess, that married life appears to agree with you. You're absolutely glowing." "Thank you, Lady Bransford. It agrees with me remarkably well." "And you, Your Grace," Lady Bransford continued, addressing Richard. "You look rather pleased with yourself." "I am married to the most extraordinary woman in England," Richard said, smiling down at Francesca. "I believe I have every right to be pleased." That set the tone for the evening. Richard danced with Francesca 3 times, highly improper for a married couple, but no one dared comment. They spoke with various lords and ladies, accepting congratulations and deflecting impertinent questions with practiced ease. At one point, Francesca found herself near the terrace doors, the same doors she had walked through with Henry to have their engagement ended. She turned to Richard. "Do you know what happened the last time I was in this room?" "I do," he said quietly. "I was watching." "Were you?" "I was watching you all evening. I saw Henry dancing with other ladies. I saw the expression on your face, not hurt but resigned, calculating, and I thought to myself, she's planning something." He touched her cheek gently. "And then I saw you walk onto that terrace with him, and my heart nearly stopped. But I waited. I had promised to wait after all. And then you emerged without him, without your ring, with your head held high. And I knew it was time. You had the carriage ready." "I had the carriage ready the moment you arrived at the ball," he admitted. "Just in case. Hope springs eternal even in the heart of a cynic." "You're not a cynic," Francesca said softly. "You're a romantic. You just hide it well." "Perhaps," he conceded. "Or perhaps I'm only a romantic when it comes to you." They danced again, and this time Francesca noticed something. The whispers had changed. Instead of scandalized mutterings, she heard snatches of conversation, quite devoted to her. Never seen the Duke smile so much, actually rather romantic when you think about it, clearly making her happy. By the end of the evening, the tide had turned. The consensus seemed to be that while the Duke and Duchess of Westwyck had certainly conducted their courtship in an unconventional manner, they were obviously well-suited and deeply in love. And really, wasn't that preferable to a proper courtship leading to an unhappy marriage? As they left the ball, Richard helped Francesca into their carriage with a satisfied smile. "I believe," he said, "that went rather well." "They've accepted us," Francesca marveled. "They've accepted that we're happy," Richard corrected. "That's a rather different thing, but ultimately, it's the only thing that matters." In the weeks that followed, Francesca settled into her new life as Duchess. She involved herself in Richard's charitable work, particularly his efforts to improve conditions in industrial towns. She hosted dinners and salons, gathering reformers and intellectuals to discuss social issues. She reconnected with old friends and made new ones. And every night she fell asleep in Richard's arms, grateful beyond measure that she had found the courage to choose honesty over poetry, substance over style, true love over convenient affection. One evening, 3 months after their wedding, they sat together in Richard's study. He was reviewing estate accounts while Francesca read correspondence from one of the orphanages she patronized. It was comfortable, companionable, the kind of domestic intimacy that would have seemed impossibly dull to her 3 years ago, but now felt perfect. "Richard," she said suddenly. "Hmm?" He looked up from his papers. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had chosen you 3 years ago?" He considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but I think perhaps everything happened exactly as it needed to." "How so?" 3 years ago, you weren't ready for me, for what I was offering. You needed to see the contrast, to experience the difference between pretty words and genuine regard. If you had chosen me then, you might always have wondered if you made the right decision. You might have resented me for being practical instead of romantic." He set aside his papers and came to sit beside her. "But now you know exactly what you chose and why. There's no doubt, no second guessing. You're saying I needed to be engaged to Henry to truly appreciate you." "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that you needed to see both paths clearly before you could choose the right one with certainty. And Francesca," he took her hand, "I would have waited another 3 years or 6 or 9 if that's what you needed, because you are worth any amount of waiting." She kissed him for that, long and sweet. "You know," she said when they broke apart, 3 years ago, I thought you were cold and distant. I thought you didn't know how to express emotion. And now I know you express emotion differently, not in flowery speeches or grand gestures, but in patient waiting, in honest words, in being there steadily when I needed you most." She touched his face. "That's real, Richard. That's the kind of love that lasts." "Good," he said, pulling her into his lap, "because I intend for it to last a lifetime." 1 year later. The drawing room of Westwick Abbey was filled with afternoon sunlight and the sound of feminine laughter. Francesca, now visibly pregnant, sat with Catherine and Margaret Hartley, planning the summer charity gala that had become one of London's most anticipated events. "We should have the orchestra in the East Garden," Catherine suggested, "and perhaps some of those lovely Japanese lanterns for when it gets dark." "Brilliant," Francesca agreed, making notes. "And Richard suggested we auction some of the produce from the tenant farms, with proceeds going to the orphanages." "That man of yours has a good heart," Margaret said warmly. "How is he taking the news about the baby?" Francesca smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "He's impossible. He won't let me do anything remotely strenuous. Yesterday, I reached for a book on a high shelf and he practically had an apoplexy." "Edward was the same way when I was expecting," Margaret said. "They mean well, even if they're suffocating." As if summoned by the conversation, Richard appeared in the doorway. "I'm not suffocating," he protested. "I'm merely ensuring my wife doesn't injure herself or the baby. I was reaching for a book, not scaling the Tower of London," Francesca pointed out. "A very high shelf," Richard countered. "You could have fallen." Catherine and Margaret exchanged amused glances. "We'll leave you two to debate the dangers of book retrieval," Catherine said, rising. "Francesca, we'll finalize the details next week?" "Perfect. Thank you both for coming." After the ladies departed, Richard came to sit beside Francesca, immediately pulling her feet into his lap to massage them. "How are you feeling?" "Enormous," she said, but she was smiling. "The baby is very active today." Richard's hand joined hers on her belly, and his face lit up when he felt the movement. "Strong, like his mother." "Or her," Francesca reminded him. "We don't know yet. Her, then. Strong and clever and beautiful, like her mother." "You're biased." "Unrepentantly so." He kissed her softly. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Only 3 times. You're falling behind schedule." "Then I love you," he said seriously. "I love you, I love you, I love you." There, back on schedule. Francesca laughed, the sound full and joyful. "Do you remember," she said, settling back against the cushions, "when you asked me if I ever wondered what would have happened if I'd chosen you 3 years earlier? I do. I've been thinking about that. And I've realized I'm glad things happened the way they did. Not because I enjoyed being engaged to Henry," she added quickly, "but because going through that taught me something important, which is that love isn't about grand gestures or pretty words. It's about showing up. It's about being honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. It's about waiting and trusting and choosing someone every single day." She took his hand. "You did all of that for me, Richard. For 3 years you showed up. You were honest, you waited. And when I finally realized what I had been missing, you were there. Exactly as you promised you would be." "I always will be," he said quietly. "For the rest of our lives, Francesca, I will be here, showing up, being honest, choosing you every single day." "I know," she smiled. "That's what makes you different from men like Henry. He made promises he never intended to keep. You make promises and then spend your life honoring them." "Speaking of Henry," Richard said with a slight grimace, "I heard something interesting yesterday. Apparently he's engaged again." "Is he?" Francesca felt nothing but mild curiosity. Henry Talbot had become such a distant memory that news of him barely registered. "To whom?" "Miss Georgiana Hartwell, the sugar heiress." Ah, another large dowry to pay off his debts. Precisely, though I understand to protect her interests. Apparently, our little scandal taught several families to be more careful about fortune-hunting heirs. Well, Francesca said philosophically, if something good came from it, I suppose I can't complain, though I do feel sorry for Miss Hartwell. As do I. But she's apparently quite determined and her father is keeping a close watch. Perhaps it will work out better than we think. Or perhaps she'll be miserable, realize her mistake, and run away with someone far better in a dramatic midnight escape, Francesca suggested, eyes twinkling. That does seem to be an effective strategy, Richard agreed solemnly. I hear it worked out rather well for one particular lady. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, Richard's hand gently rubbing circles on Francesca's belly, feeling their child move and kick. Richard, Francesca said suddenly, do you know what day it is? He thought for a moment, then understanding dawned. It's been exactly 1 year. 1 year since the Ashford house ball. 1 year since you picked me up in your carriage and changed my entire life. Changed both our lives, he corrected. Do you know what I want to do today? What's that, my dear? I want to go back to London. I want to attend a ball, not Ashford House, they're dreadful, and I want to dance with my husband 3 improper times and scandalize all the gossips again. Richard laughed. Francesca, you're 7 months pregnant. I'm not certain the gossips will be scandalized so much as concerned for your health. Fine. Then we'll attend a dinner party and I'll make witty conversation and you'll look at me like I'm the most fascinating woman in the world, and everyone will see how happy we are. I look at you like that all the time, Richard pointed out. I know, that's why I married you. She struggled to sit up, and he immediately helped her, adjusting cushions behind her back. But truly, Richard, I want to go back to London for a little while. Show everyone that the scandalous Duchess of Westwick is now the respectable, happy, very pregnant Duchess of Westwick. Let them see what real love looks like. If that's what you want, then that's what we'll do. He kissed her forehead. Though I reserve the right to hover protectively and deny you access to high shelves. Agreed, she said, laughing. They did return to London that week, and they did attend a dinner party at the Bransford residence, the same place where they had made their first public appearance as a married couple. This time there was no scandal, no whispered gossip. Instead, they were greeted warmly. Francesca's pregnancy was congratulated by all, and the evening passed in pleasant conversation with friends. At one point, Francesca found herself standing near those infamous terrace doors again, Richard at her side. Lady Bransford noticed and approached them with a knowing smile. It's remarkable, isn't it? Their hostess said. How one night can change everything. I was here, you know, when Mr. Talbot ended your engagement. And then when the Duke's carriage appeared, she shook her head. Most romantic thing I've seen in 40 years of London seasons. I'm glad you think so, Francesca said. At the time, I wasn't certain if it was romantic or simply reckless. The best romance always involves a bit of recklessness, Lady Bransford said wisely. Playing it safe gives you security, perhaps, but not happiness. You, my dear Duchess, chose happiness, and you— She turned to Richard. You had the patience to wait for her to make that choice. That's true romance. After she moved away, Richard pulled Francesca close as her belly would allow. She's right, you know, about the recklessness. Are you saying you were reckless, Your Grace? You who plan everything down to the smallest detail? Completely reckless, he confirmed. I had no guarantee you would choose me, no certainty that waiting would pay off. But I did it anyway because the thought of a life without you was unbearable. And now, she asked softly, now I have everything I ever wanted. You, our child on the way, a life built on honesty and real affection. He rested his hand on her belly. Now I am the luckiest man in England. Not luck, Francesca corrected. Patience, strategy, and a very well-timed carriage appearance. All crucial elements, he agreed, laughing. They left the party early. Richard was adamant that Francesca not tire herself, and returned to the London house. As they prepared for bed, Francesca caught sight of herself in the mirror, Richard standing behind her, his hands resting on her swollen belly. Look at us, she said wonderingly. 2 years ago I was engaged to the wrong man, miserable and pretending not to be. Now I'm married to the right man, expecting our child, and happier than I ever imagined possible. 2 years ago, Richard said, meeting her eyes in the mirror, I was alone watching you from afar, hoping you would see what I saw. Now I wake up every morning with you beside me, and I still can't quite believe you're real." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm real. This is real. And Richard, thank you." "For what?" "For waiting. For being honest. For giving me a choice instead of making assumptions about what I wanted. For loving me enough to let me make my own mistakes and find my own way back to you. I would do it all again," he said simply. 1,000 times over, if it meant ending up here, with you, 3 months later. "One more effort, Your Grace. He's nearly here." Francesca, drenched in sweat and exhausted beyond measure, summoned her last reserves of strength and pushed. The midwife's encouraging voice seemed to come from very far away, but Richard's hand in hers was solid and real, anchoring her. And then, a cry. A beautiful, furious, indignant cry. "It's a boy," the midwife announced joyfully. "A healthy baby boy." Francesca fell back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as the midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets. Richard's face was wet with tears too, his expression one of absolute wonder as the midwife placed their son in Francesca's arms. "Hello, little one," Francesca whispered, staring down at the tiny, perfect face. "Hello, my darling boy." Richard leaned over them both, one arm around Francesca, one hand gently touching the baby's downy dark hair. "He's perfect," he breathed. "Absolutely perfect." "He has your nose," Francesca observed, laughing through her tears. "Poor child," Richard said, but he was smiling. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names for months, unable to agree on anything. But looking down at her son now, Francesca knew. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Richard Wycliffe. After your ancestor who founded Westwick, and after you." "Thomas," Richard repeated softly, and the baby's eyes, grey like his father's, opened at the sound. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." The midwife and her assistants bustled about, cleaning up and checking that both mother and baby were healthy. Richard refused to leave Francesca's side, even when tradition dictated he should wait outside. He sat on the bed beside her, one arm around her shoulders, watching their son with an expression of such pure love that Francesca's heart ached. "Thank you," he whispered finally. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for giving me this, all of this. You and Thomas and this life we've built together." "We built it together," Francesca corrected. "Every choice, every day, together." Little Thomas yawned, a tiny sound, and nestled closer to his mother's chest. Looking at him, Francesca thought about the journey that had brought her here. The broken engagement, the midnight carriage ride, the decision to choose truth over comfort. She thought about Henry Talbot, married now to his sugar heiress, still chasing wealth and pleasure with no understanding of real happiness. She thought about her younger self, so desperate for poetry and romance that she had nearly missed the real thing. And she thought about Richard, patient, honest, steadfast Richard, who had loved her enough to wait, to let her make her own choices, to be there when she finally understood what true love looked like. "Do you know what I was thinking?" she said softly. "That night at Ashford House, when I got into your carriage." "What's that?" "I was thinking that I had wasted 3 years, that I had been such a fool to reject you the first time." "And now?" Richard asked. "Now I think I was exactly as foolish as I needed to be, because those 3 years taught me to appreciate what we have. They taught me the difference between infatuation and love. They taught me that the quiet, steady kind of devotion you offer is worth 1,000 grand gestures." She looked up at him, this man who had waited so patiently, who had caught her when she finally took the leap. "We didn't waste those 3 years, Richard. We needed them. I needed them." "I love you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have loved you since the moment I first saw you. I loved you when you chose someone else. I loved you while I waited for you to see the truth. And I will love you every day for the rest of our lives." "I know," Francesca said simply. "That's what makes this real." Thomas stirred in her arms, making soft baby noises. Richard reached out and took his son's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around his father's much larger one. "He's strong," Richard observed. "He comes from strong stock," Francesca replied, "though heaven help us when he's older. Can you imagine the mischief our child will get into with your stubbornness and my temper?" "Terrifying," Richard agreed cheerfully. "We shall be entirely grey by the time he's 10. "Worth it," Francesca said, looking down at Thomas's perfect little face. "Every moment," Richard confirmed. 10 years later, the gardens of Westwick Abbey were in full bloom, filled with roses and peonies and the laughter of children. Young Thomas, now an energetic 10-year-old, was teaching his younger sister Eleanor, 7, and brother William, 5, how to climb trees, despite his mother's protests that such activities were unladylike for Eleanor and too dangerous for William. "They're children, Francesca," Richard said, watching the scene with amusement as he sat beside his wife on a garden bench. "Let them be children." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to explain to the governess why Eleanor's dress is covered in tree sap," Francesca grumbled, but she was smiling. Over the past 10 years their family had grown, their love had deepened, and Westwick Abbey had become a home filled with warmth and laughter. Richard's agricultural reforms had improved the lives of countless tenant farmers. Francesca's charitable work had expanded to include schools for working-class children and safe houses for women fleeing dangerous situations. They had become a formidable team, respected in Parliament, beloved by their tenants, admired in society. But more importantly, they had remained partners in every sense of the word, equal collaborators in life's great adventure. Catherine Pemberton, now Catherine Sinclair, having married a kind Scottish doctor, visited often with her own children. Edward and Margaret Hartley were regular guests, their children fast friends with the young Wycliffes. Even Francesca's mother had come around completely, visiting frequently and spoiling her grandchildren outrageously. As for Henry Talbot, he had faded into obscurity. His marriage to Georgiana Hartwell had ended in scandal and separation, when his gambling debts became impossible to ignore. He now lived in modest circumstances on his father's estate. His charm and good looks faded by dissipation. Francesca rarely thought of him anymore. When she did, it was with pity rather than anger. He had chosen pleasure over substance, and he was paying the price. "Mother! Father!" Thomas called from his perch high in an oak tree. "Look how high I am." "Very impressive, darling," Francesca called back. "Please don't fall." "I won't," he assured her with all the confidence of a 10-year-old boy who believed himself invincible. Eleanor, not to be outdone, climbed to a nearby branch. "I'm just as high as Thomas." "You're both very brave," Richard called, then added under his breath to Francesca, "They get that from you." "They get their recklessness from you," Francesca countered. "You're the one who decided to propose by offering me a scandalous midnight carriage ride." "I offered you transportation," Richard protested. "The scandal was your choice." "Best choice I ever made," she said, leaning against him. William, unable to climb as high as his older siblings, sat at the base of the tree and began making up an elaborate story about dragons and knights. He was the dreamer of the family, always lost in imaginary worlds. "He reminds me of you," Richard observed. "The way you used to talk about books and stories. And Thomas reminds me of you, serious and determined. Eleanor is her own force of nature entirely." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play. This, Francesca thought, was what happiness looked like. Not the dramatic, sweeping romance she had imagined as a girl, but something better. Daily joy, shared laughter, partnership and friendship, and love, all woven together into something strong and enduring. "Richard," she said suddenly, "do you remember that conversation we had the night you brought me to Westwick, about poetry versus reality?" "I do. I've been thinking about it lately, and I've realized this is poetry. Our life together, our children, the quiet moments and the chaotic ones. This is the poetry I was looking for all along. I just didn't recognize it because it didn't come wrapped in pretty words." Richard took her hand, raising it to his lips. "Then I shall endeavor to write you poetry every day for the rest of our lives. Not with words, but with actions, with presence, with choosing you again and again, every single morning." "That," Francesca said, "is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I'm learning," he said with a smile. Thomas and Eleanor climbed down from their trees, arguing good-naturedly about who had climbed higher. William abandoned his dragon story to chase a butterfly through the garden, and Richard and Francesca sat together on their bench, hands intertwined, watching the life they had built together unfold in sunshine and laughter. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Richard and Francesca stood together on the terrace overlooking the gardens, much as they had done countless times before. "Do you ever think about that night?" Francesca asked. "The night everything changed?" "Sometimes," Richard admitted. "But mostly I think about this, all the nights since then. All the mornings, all the ordinary moments that have been in their way more extraordinary than any dramatic carriage rescue could ever be. Even the moments when Thomas broke your favorite vase playing cavalry in the drawing room. Even those," Richard said firmly, "though I maintain that that particular vase was not actually my favorite. You're a terrible liar." "I know." He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I never learned to lie convincingly. One of my many flaws." "Not a flaw," Francesca said. "One of your virtues. Honesty, remember? That's what I fell in love with. Not your title, not your wealth, not even your handsome face. I have a handsome face. But your honesty, your steadiness, your absolute unwavering certainty that we belong together, even when I was too foolish to see it." "You weren't foolish," Richard said. "You were young. You were looking for magic in all the wrong places. But you found it eventually." "I found you," she corrected. "And you, Richard Wycliffe, Duke of Westwick, are the best magic I've ever known." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and full of a decade's worth of love and partnership. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Come to bed, Duchess," Richard said. "Tomorrow Thomas has lessons, Eleanor wants to learn to ride properly, and William has somehow convinced the cook to let him help make bread. We'll need our rest." "Sounds terrifying," Francesca said cheerfully. "Sounds perfect," Richard corrected, and hand in hand they walked back into Westwick Abbey, their home, their sanctuary, the place where a scandalous midnight carriage ride had led them to everything they had ever wanted, but hadn't known to ask for. Behind them the gardens lay peaceful in the moonlight. Above them, stars glittered in the endless sky. And ahead of them stretched years and years of this, of ordinary magic, of daily choices, of love that didn't announce itself with grand gestures, but proved itself in 1,000 small moments. Francesca had once thought that leaving her broken engagement without a word was the end of her story, but it had been in fact just the beginning. The carriage that came for her that night hadn't rescued her. It had delivered her to exactly where she was meant to be, home with the man who had loved her enough to wait, to trust, to believe that she would find her way to him eventually. And she had. And they lived, not happily ever after in the fairy tale sense, but happily ever forward, building their happiness new each day, choosing each other every morning, writing their own poetry in the language of real, honest, enduring love, which, Francesca reflected as she fell asleep in Richard's arms that night, was the best kind of poetry there was. The end. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this beautiful journey. We hope Lady Francesca and the Duke of Westwick touched your heart the way they touched ours. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue crafting stories filled with deep emotions, powerful redemptions, and the kind of love that stays with you long after the final words are spoken. And don't forget, at the end of this video, another unforgettable story awaits. Click it now and let yourself be swept away once more. Thank you for being here, the Legends of Love team.